This is the macro threshold. History operates on fiscal cycles, and for the American stable class, the clock is striking the high watermark. Since 1776, every global hegemon has tracked a 250-year arc of ascent, zenith, and structural restructuring. We are currently observing the Q4 2025, Q1 2026 fiscal timeline. The structural mathematics are unambiguous. The golden age you were promised was not stolen. It was architected with a scheduled expiration date. In this deep dive analysis, we delineate the definitive blueprint for why 2026 is the pivotal threshold year, when the functionality of the American economy undergoes permanent alteration. Welcome to the great structural unwinding. In 2 minutes, you will understand why the current economic discomfort is not a cyclical recession to be weathered, but the final necessary systemic friction preceding a permanent redefinition of economic access in the United States. Here at Macro Threshold, your intelligence front operates solely on objective structural data, divorced from political rhetoric or emotional market noise. Our mandate is to analyze the mathematical inevitability of the permanent alteration to the American wealth accumulation model. Emotional response is an irrelevant variable. Only the fiscal architecture merits consideration. We must begin by establishing the operational definition of the segment we are analyzing. The stable class, colloquially referred to as the middle class. Historically, its core definition rested on 2 pillars: the capacity for durable asset ownership, primarily real estate and a reliable capital stack, and the capacity for intergenerational wealth, transfer through savings and equity appreciation. The mechanism that sustained this definition for the past 50 years was not actual income growth, but the seamless, perpetual mechanism of debt rollover and managed cash flow. To understand the 2026 sunset date, you must first understand this mechanism. This is our core covenant. The average middle-class household, particularly post-2008, maintained its standard of living by exploiting consistently declining interest rates. Their existence was predicated not on realizing substantial net savings, but on the ability to service a high volume of floating and fixed-rate debt, mortgages, auto loans, credit lines, by perpetually rolling over the principal or refinancing at lower rates. This model worked perfectly, so long as the cost of capital trended toward zero. The structural genius of this system, from the perspective of sovereign and commercial balance sheets, was that stagnant real wages were rendered invisible by inflating asset valuations and cheap credit access, creating a psychological illusion of wealth accumulation. The middle class was not accumulating wealth in the durable sense. It was accumulating leverage that felt like wealth because the cost of capital was negligible. The shift that defines the 2026 threshold is simple. The mechanism of perpetual debt rollover is mathematically broken by the sustained high interest rate regime initiated by the Federal Reserve's necessary response to endemic inflation. When the average cost of capital exceeds the marginal growth rate of median household income, solvency becomes an arithmetic impossibility. The system transitions from a sustainable, albeit fragile equilibrium, to a guaranteed trajectory towards systemic insolvency for the 3rd and 4th income quintiles. This realization is the core stress test defining the present economic climate. We identify the decline of the stable class through 3 distinct phases, leading inexorably to the Phase 4 threshold. Phase 1, the silent erosion, 1980-2008. This phase was characterized by the decoupling of productivity gains from wage growth and the simultaneous introduction of financialization as the dominant economic engine. The stable class began to fund their lifestyle not through increasing labor value, but through maximizing credit access. The operational definition of solvency began its slow transition from net worth to managed liquidity. Phase 2, the leverage addiction, 2008-2022. Following the Great Financial Crisis, the response was a decade of quantitative easing, resulting in near zero interest rates. This period reinforced the dependency on leverage. The middle class was incentivized to take on massive, historically cheap debt, student loans, inflated mortgages, serial auto financing, to maintain an appearance of the previous generation's standard of living. This was the mirage of solvency, where rising home equity did not translate to disposable income, but merely permitted a larger, more expensive mortgage refinance cycle. Phase 3, the interest rate. Shock, 2022-2025. This is the current phase of active structural unwinding. The rapid transition from near zero to high real interest rates has 2 immediate effects. First, it makes new debt prohibitively expensive, eliminating the liquidity management capacity essential for consumption. Second, and more critically, it renders the existing debt stock, particularly adjustable rate products or those requiring refinancing, unsustainable. The rolling maturities of corporate and household debt are now being met with significantly higher debt service costs, creating systemic friction across the consumer credit spectrum, a friction currently peaking in auto loan delinquencies and secondary market credit card distress. This immediate, mathematically induced reduction in discretionary cash flow is what you feel daily. To quantify this inevitability, we look at the structural indicators defining the 2026 inflection point. Consider the household debt-to-income DTI ratio for the third income quartile. This segment, the true core of the stable class, has seen its DTI ratio surpass the functional stress limit of 350% in many regions when factoring in non-mortgage liabilities. The unsustainability here is systemic, not anecdotal. This leverage overload implies that the majority of income is allocated merely to debt servicing, eliminating any capacity for the durable savings or private investment that defines an economically secure segment. Furthermore, the structural decoupling of the American dream benchmark, property ownership, is now complete. The cost of housing as a percentage of median income, excluding the top decile, has reached levels not seen since the pre-Depression era, often exceeding 45% of gross income in major growth corridors. When debt service costs and essential living expenses consume nearly half of a household's income, the operational definition of the middle class, the capacity to withstand unexpected shocks and accumulate capital, is functionally annihilated. Employment recovery, while robust in nominal terms, no longer translates to durable net wealth generation because real wages, adjusted for both CPI and asset inflation since 2008, show a net negative trend. You might be earning more dollars, but those dollars buy you less economic leverage and zero ownership capacity. File that away. Your struggle to afford a home or service your student loan is not a personal failing. It is the predictable mathematical outcome of a fiscal architecture designed to maximize leverage extraction from the lower 80% of the wealth distribution. The capital stack that defined your parents' stability has been inverted, relying on perpetual capital inflow rather than earned equity. We've established the structural mathematics of insolvency facing the stable class through the current Phase 3 liquidation cycle. Now comes the uncomfortable truth. This liquidation must inevitably trigger a massive systemic response, the details of which define Phase 4. The first consequence of this structural stress is the silent forced liquidation of inherited durable assets, the generational transfer failure. As the younger generations face insurmountable debt burdens, coupled with unaffordable entry points into housing, the wealth transfer from the boomer generation to subsequent generations will not be used for investment or growth, but merely to shore up liquidity gaps and service existing debt. The inherited capital will be consumed defensively, stopping the systemic leakage rather than fueling new growth. This is not accumulation, it is stasis maintenance. The peak of consumer credit distress is mathematically scheduled for late 2024 through the end of 2025, fueled by the full impact of sustained high rates cycling through fixed-term liabilities. This widespread, synchronized systemic friction creates a mandatory turning point for the sovereign system. The government will face the mathematical inevitability of massive intervention and debt monetization as the singular systemic palliative. The alternative, a full-scale, uncontrolled collapse of credit markets and asset values, is politically and fiscally intolerable to the established order. Therefore, the response will be a guaranteed systemic injection of liquidity, likely under the guise of an emergency spending package or novel monetary policy tools. This intervention will not restore the previous system, it will establish the new administrative regime. The Phase 4 regime, commencing post-2026, involves a system where economic security is permanently decoupled from private capital accumulation and predicated instead upon access to subsidized services and controlled social capital. Think less private property ownership and more long-term, government or institutionally managed leases, less durable savings and more reliance on social security nets indexed to government-managed inflation metrics. The ability to climb the ladder through private enterprise or asset accumulation will be structurally constrained to the top quintile, while the stable class will transition into an economically managed tier receiving essential services and limited capital access, conditional upon adherence to the new fiscal architecture. This is the structural correction, the formalization of the post-equity economy. The objective of this analysis is not to forecast chaos, but to comprehend the inherent structure of the incoming regime. The question defining the 2026 threshold is not if the middle class ends, but what replaces it. Is this structural alteration a painful yet necessary class system correction demanded by 2 generations of unsustainable leverage? Or is it the definitive liquidation of the core American promise, that hard work translates into ownership and autonomy? The current trajectory suggests the latter, formalized by fiscal policy rather than revolutionary action. We must accept the data. The engine of durable wealth accumulation for the median household has stalled not temporarily, but permanently due to structural engineering constraints introduced over the last 40 years and solidified by the recent cost of capital shock. Wealth has not disappeared, it has simply changed hands. The critical question remains, who is holding it now? We have established the structural inevitability of the 2026 economic regime shift and analyzed the insolvency diagnosis of the American stable class. Now comes the uncomfortable part, understanding the architecture of the new regime and identifying the entities positioned to capitalize on the structural liquidation. This is not about predicting chaos. It is about recognizing the mathematical sequence of permanent economic alteration. The core villain in this narrative is not inflation, high interest rates, or political malfeasance. These are merely symptoms. The true architect of the great wealth transfer is what the street coldly calls dry powder. Dry powder refers to the immense reserves of capital, often held by private equity firms, sovereign wealth funds, and massive institutional investment vehicles awaiting deployment. Estimates consistently place this global liquidity pool north of $2.5 trillion, specifically earmarked for distressed assets. This capital is parasitic. It requires instability to function optimally and critically. It views the impending stress in the household balance sheet, the very stress we quantified in Block 1 regarding unsustainable household debt-to-income ratios, not as a crisis, but as the largest liquidation sale of durable assets since the 2008 collapse. Let us define the operational sequence. The stability of the American middle class was historically predicated upon two pillars: equity accumulation, primarily housing, and small business ownership. When the Federal Reserve and global central banks rapidly hiked the cost of capital, they effectively weaponized high interest rates against the most leveraged demographic, the median income earner trying to service mortgage debt, auto loans, and crucially increasingly expensive consumer credit. This is the leverage overload finally manifesting. As the financial friction escalates through 2024 and 2025, the anticipated peak of consumer credit distress, liquidity dries up. The small investor, the median home buyer, and the independent regional bank all contract. This forces a silent, slow, but relentless forced liquidation of inherited durable assets. If a family cannot refinance their home equity loan, cannot service the new rate on their variable debt, or faces unemployment due to recessionary pressure on small employers, they must sell. This is the liquidity event that dry powder has been anticipating. They do not buy at the peak. They wait for forced sellers, creating what economists refer to as efficient capital allocation through distress. The beauty of this mechanism, from a purely fiscal perspective, is its silence. There are no dramatic runs on banks, only a steady downward pressure on the stable class's net wealth. Private equity funds backed by pensions and institutional reserves, often ironically including the minimal savings of the very class they are liquidating, step in to acquire entire portfolios of distressed residential debt, single-family rental properties, and fractional small business equity at severe discounts. This is the central covenant of the structural unwinding. The American middle class loses its most effective tool for generational wealth transfer, property ownership, and equity accumulation, and the large institutions gain permanent, yielding assets secured by the same real estate, now servicing rental agreements instead of ownership deeds. Keep that in mind. The system requires high interest rates to purge the excess leverage created during the previous decade of ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. But the purification process always burns the borrower, not the lender, and certainly not the institutional buyer waiting patiently on the sidelines. The timeline is critical here. By late 2025, the compounding effect of sustained high rates colliding with high DTI ratios creates systemic friction that spills far beyond housing. It destabilizes local economies dependent on small business lending. This is where the structural stress becomes political instability. No governing body can survive a truly organic financial collapse of the median citizen base without intervention. And here we arrive at the mathematical inevitability: massive governmental intervention and debt monetization. When the economic pain reaches the critical threshold, when defaults threaten not just households but the largest lenders holding securitized consumer debt, the government must act as the systemic palliative. Why? Not to save the middle class, but to save the financial architecture itself. The only tool available to absorb losses of this magnitude is the national balance sheet, backed by the central bank's ability to create liquidity ex nihilo. This process, often masked through various quantitative easing protocols, infrastructure bills, or direct fiscal transfers, is fundamentally an act of socializing private and institutional risk. The bad debt, the consequence of overleveraging and structural mispricing over the last 20 years, cannot be allowed to collapse the financial system. Therefore, the inevitable structural progression is this: the middle class incurs the lost equity, reduced real wages. The dry powder capital absorbs the assets at a discount, privatized gain. And then the government steps in to backstop the losses of the largest financial institutions, socialized risk. This dynamic sets the stage for the new administrative regime post-2026. The post-2026 economic environment is characterized by an explicit decoupling of security from private capital accumulation. For the top 5% of wealth holders, capital continues to multiply because they own the productive assets, now acquired at a discount. For the median citizen, who has lost their primary wealth-generating mechanism, housing equity and durable savings, economic security shifts from autonomy to dependence. How does this dependence manifest? Through subsidized services. The state, having monetized significant new debt to stabilize the system, offers essential services, healthcare, educational access, potentially universal basic income in localized forms, that are conditional upon adherence to the administrative regime. Your housing security is not predicated on ownership, but on access to controlled, institutionally owned rental markets or public, subsidized housing schemes. Your capacity to accumulate wealth privately shrinks, but your ability to survive is guaranteed through access to state-managed resources. This structural shift is not revolutionary in the traditional sense. It is administrative, fiscal, and ultimately permanent. It moves the system from one predicated on decentralized private ownership and free market competition, the theoretical promise of the previous golden age, to one predicated on centralized control of durable assets and bureaucratic allocation of resources and consumption capacity. Keep that in mind. This is the core tragedy. The systematic destruction of the medium-scale independent actor, the fundamental unit of the American dream, accomplished not by a crash, but by a coordinated structural removal of their primary leverage and subsequent capitalization of their assets by entities with superior access to capital and political influence. This brings us to the most defining covenant of the incoming regime, the socialization of the prejuízo, loss. The true cost of rescuing the system is borne not today, but tomorrow, through continuous embedded inflation, a tax on every dollar of savings and every unit of future purchasing power. The debt that the government monetizes to stabilize the banking sector, to fund the necessary social palliatives, and to maintain the appearance of growth does not disappear. It is converted into currency devaluation. The American stable class is forced to pay for its own liquidation through the slow, insidious erosion of their remaining stored value. The loss of the golden age is not merely an economic contraction. It is the establishment of a mathematical framework where the median individual S future trajectory is structurally capped, regardless of productivity or education, because the fundamental capacity to leverage debt for wealth, instead of merely consumption, has been privatized by the few. We must conclude with a sobering historical parallel. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, facing similar runaway inflationary pressures, central banks around the world were forced to implement unprecedented interest rates. When Paul Volcker raised the Fed funds rate to nearly 20%, it broke the back of inflation, yes, but it concurrently broke entire national economies, most notably heavily dollar-denominated emerging markets like Brazil and Mexico, triggering the infamous Latin American debt crisis. The rate shock was fatal to leverage players. We are watching a similar structural shock occur domestically. But unlike the 1980s, the financial system is far more complex and the national debt far less manageable. The medicine, high rates, is killing the patient. The middle-class balance sheet, slowly, not swiftly, allowing for optimal structural arbitrage by the powerful. The question is not if the system can survive, but who will pay the price for the survival of the system. We have seen what interest rates near 20% did to high-leverage emerging economies in the past. If 20% interest rates broke the back of leveraged nations like Brazil once, what happens now when the U.S. domestic economy, highly leveraged and structurally fragile, faces a cost of capital shock that is designed to purge trillions in accumulated excess liquidity? The answer is structural inflation, the topic of our next analysis. Do not miss the big lie. Why inflation never goes away. Evidence.